Picture this: June 6th, 1944. A date burned into history. A day when the tide of tyranny would begin its inevitable retreat. This was the day freedom launched its most audacious counterattack against the darkness that had consumed Europe. Between 1939 and 1941, Adolf Hitler's war machine had blazed a merciless path across the continent. Nation after nation fell beneath the jackboot. The swastika cast its shadow over lands from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow. Hitler's appetite for conquest seemed insatiable. The entire world was his prize, and death was his favorite weapon. Only Britain remained, battered, bleeding, desperately clinging to survival. But she held on, just long enough to prove that all of Europe wouldn't bow to the Nazi regime. Then, in just 3 short years, everything changed. Britain, Canada, the United States, and countless allied nations forged themselves into a single, unstoppable force. And in one brilliant, coordinated assault, they drove a dagger straight into the heart of Hitler's dreams. That dagger struck on the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, and once driven home, it would twist into a wound that would never, ever heal. This is the story of Operation Overlord. This is the story of D-Day. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns. Japan, Hitler's ally in the East, had awakened a sleeping giant. And in a move that would seal his fate, Hitler, against the advice of his own generals, declared war on the United States just 4 days later. Suddenly, the equation changed. America's vast industrial might, her endless agricultural resources, her seemingly limitless manpower, all of it now arrayed against the Nazi regime. The Allies had new pieces on the board. The question was, how would they play them? From Moscow, Stalin demanded action. Open a second front, he insisted. Hit them now. In the summer of 1942, many American commanders agreed. Strike while the iron is hot. But Churchill and Roosevelt? They were more cautious. They understood that rushing into battle unprepared was a recipe for disaster. British Commonwealth forces were still locked in a bitter struggle with German and Italian armies in North Africa. Pulling troops for a premature invasion of Western Europe could collapse that entire front. And there was so much to do. Supply chains to build, intelligence to gather, troops to train for the specific hell of an amphibious assault, German defenses to weaken, and most importantly, the Nazi war machine itself had to be pummeled from the air until it gasped for breath. So Stalin was told the invasion would wait until 1943. He was furious, but Churchill had made him a promise. Allied troops would land in Europe in 1942, and Churchill was a man of his word. August 1942, the French coastal town of Dieppe. This wasn't the grand invasion Stalin wanted, but it was something. A large-scale raid that would remind the Germans the Western Front wasn't dead. Perhaps it would draw German forces away from the Soviet Union, where they were still advancing on Moscow. Operation Jubilee, they called it. Over 10,500 men, primarily Canadian troops, were given a seemingly straightforward mission. Storm ashore, capture the port, demolish German defenses, gather intelligence, and get out. It should have taken hours. It became a massacre. Within 6 brutal hours, the survivors were in full retreat. Nearly 1,500 Allied soldiers lay dead. Many more were captured. The RAF and USAF lost aircraft to skilled Luftwaffe pilots. The Royal Navy lost a destroyer and numerous landing craft. For those who had advocated for an immediate full-scale invasion, Dieppe was a cold, sobering slap in the face. This was what storming Fortress Europe would cost if they got it wrong. The beaches would run red with Allied blood. But abandoning the idea of invading Europe? Unthinkable. The question wasn't if, but when and how. Meanwhile, in the scorching deserts of North Africa, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, charismatic, brilliant, and supremely confident, had managed something remarkable. He'd stopped Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, at El Alamein. Then, with American forces landing in Tunisia as part of Operation Torch, the trap began to close. German and Italian forces found themselves crushed from all sides. By June 9th, 1943, Rommel had been expelled from Africa entirely. With a direct assault on France still deemed too risky until 1944, Churchill proposed an alternative: invade Italy and push northward through what he called Europe's soft underbelly. Sicily fell first, then mainland Italy in September. The Italian people, sick of Mussolini's fascist regime, began to turn against him. The Allied advance sped up until it didn't. German forces, along with loyal fascist Italian troops, dug in. What should have been a swift march north became a grinding, bloody slog. But now Germany was fighting intensive wars on two major fronts, struggling to occupy their conquered territories while Allied forces grew stronger and better prepared. The time was finally right to turn attention back to Western Europe. Two critical questions faced Allied leadership. Who should command this operation? And where should the invasion take place? The war had created heroes on both sides of the Atlantic. In Britain, Montgomery was the obvious choice, fresh from his triumphs in North Africa and Italy, beloved by the British people. But the reality was unavoidable. The majority of troops would be American. It seemed only fitting that an American should lead. In late 1943, that responsibility fell to General Dwight David Eisenhower. The choice raised eyebrows. Other generals, Montgomery, the boisterous American George Patton, had extensive combat experience dating back to World War I. Eisenhower had spent that entire war stateside. While he'd successfully overseen the Torch and Italian landings, his lack of frontline combat experience cast a shadow over his appointment. But Eisenhower possessed something no other general could match: the ability to unite. Different nations, different personalities, different egos. Eisenhower could meld them into a single, cohesive fighting force. Under his leadership, D-Day wouldn't be three separate invasions by America, Britain, and Canada. It would be one unified assault, one shared mission: liberate Europe from Hitler's grip. As for where to invade, everyone agreed the ideal spot was Pas-de-Calais. The English Channel was narrowest there, meaning a shorter crossing and less time vulnerable at sea. It also meant maximum air cover from bases in southeast England. But here's the problem. The Germans knew this too. They'd stationed some of their finest troops there, the 15th Army under General von Salmuth. They had the best equipment, the strongest fortifications. Hitting Calais, even successfully, would be a bloodbath. The advance into mainland Europe would slow to a crawl while replacements were sourced. British Army Lieutenant General Frederick E. Morgan, serving as Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, was tasked with finding an alternative. After exhaustively examining every option, considering enemy positions and available Allied resources, he presented his recommendation in Quebec in May 1943. His words were measured but confident. "I have come to the conclusion that, in view of the limitations and resources imposed by my directives, we may be assured of a reasonable chance of success on the 1st of May, 1944, if we concentrate our efforts on an assault across the Norman beaches." The decision was made. When the day came, the day that would be known simply as D-Day, the Allied forces would invade Normandy. Hitler's stunning success in 1940, which brought Western Europe under German control, now haunted him. The conquered territory had given him an enormous coastline to defend, stretching from northern Spain up through Scandinavia. Somewhere along those thousands of miles, the Allies would strike. Perhaps remembering how his own forces had simply gone around France's impenetrable Maginot Line in 1940, Hitler ordered the construction of formidable fortifications along the entire coast. The Atlantic Wall, he called it. Concrete bunkers, natural obstacles enhanced by man-made ones, and minefields, miles upon miles of minefields. The Dieppe raid and numerous smaller British commando operations only heightened Hitler's paranoia. He ordered the wall be given top priority. But even with conscripted troops from occupied countries filling the ranks, Germany simply didn't have enough men to defend every mile equally. In August 1943, a new commander arrived who made the Allies deeply nervous: Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself. Despite his defeat in North Africa, Rommel was still respected as one of Germany's most competent military minds. Before his arrival, construction of the Atlantic Wall had ground to an apathetic crawl. Rommel changed that overnight. Officers suddenly found their workloads vastly increased. The Desert Fox was cracking the whip. But Rommel faced resistance not just from below, but from above. Some in the German high command saw him as a failure after North Africa. Others viewed him as a rival for Hitler's favor. And some simply didn't like him. When Rommel outlined his defensive strategy, he requested that German tank forces be held close to the coastline. That way, they could respond immediately to any Allied landing. Powerful panzer divisions could devastate infantry waiting ashore, prevent the establishment of a beachhead, stop fresh troops and tanks from being deployed. It made perfect sense. But Hitler and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt disagreed. They wanted the tank forces grouped together inland. Once the main Allied assault came, which they were still convinced would be at Calais, the panzers could be thrust forward as one overwhelming force and drive the Allies back into the sea. Nevertheless, Rommel remained committed. He intensified bunker construction, initiated massive mining operations along the French coast, and impressed upon his subordinates that their work could determine Germany's fate. In April 1944, less than 2 months before D-Day, Rommel stood on one of countless French beaches he was tasked with defending. He turned to his adjutant, Captain Helmuth Lang, and shared his assessment of Germany's situation. The war will be won or lost on the beaches. We'll only have one chance to stop the enemy, and that's while he's in the water. Believe me, Lang, the first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive for the Allies as well as Germany. It will be the longest day. While Rommel inspected his defenses, Allied commanders decided to test their equipment and readiness with a full-scale rehearsal. They called it Operation Tiger. 23,000 American troops assembled with their equipment at British harbors. They boarded troop ships, circled around southern England, and launched a mock invasion of Devon's beaches, which had been dressed up to resemble the Atlantic Wall. To make it realistic, the beaches were heavily shelled by American and British warships. The goal was twofold: understand how equipment like tanks would function on crater-riddled beaches, and get American troops comfortable riding toward a beach with live shells screaming overhead. Eisenhower himself watched as the invasion of Devon began on April 27th, and it was a disaster. Due to miscommunication, a group of American landing craft reached Slapton Sands while the Royal Navy was still shelling the area. Americans died from friendly fire. Once the shelling stopped, the rest of the initial force made their landings. A second wave was planned for the next day. But during the night of April 27th to 28th, the ships carrying that second wave were spotted by German E-boats prowling through Lyme Bay. British warships had detected the E-boats and were moving to intercept. But there was a catastrophic problem. They hadn't been provided with the American radio frequencies. They couldn't warn the troop ships. At 1:30 a.m. on April 28th, the E-boats attacked. Torpedoes and 40mm guns tore into the American vessels. In the chaos and carnage that followed, 749 Americans were killed. 2 troop ships sank. A third was badly damaged. Tragically, many who drowned did so because they hadn't been properly trained in using their life jackets. Like Dieppe before it, Operation Tiger was a brutal reminder. Invading Fortress Europe would be difficult, costly, and deadly if not properly prepared for. The fact that such a disaster could happen off the English coast, without German shore guns or aircraft even involved, only highlighted how dangerous transporting massive numbers of men by sea truly was. In fact, Tiger nearly derailed D-Day entirely. Several officers listed as missing after the tragedy had knowledge of the upcoming Normandy invasion. The fear was they'd been picked up by the E-boats and broken under German interrogation. Eventually, those fears were dismissed. D-Day would proceed as planned. Final planning for Normandy relied heavily on knowing exactly what the Germans had positioned around the landing zones. And this intelligence had to be gathered without alerting the Germans to Allied intentions. Beginning in April 1944, the RAF in Yuzov launched an intensive photo reconnaissance effort. High-speed fighters, Spitfires, P-38 Lightnings, P-51 Mustangs, flew daring ultra-level missions over German positions all along the European coastline. Normandy received no more attention than anywhere else, so German intelligence wouldn't flag it as a point of special interest. But flying at such low altitudes, where trees and power lines were as dangerous as enemy gunners, gave Allied commanders extraordinarily detailed images of German defenses. Many reconnaissance aircraft had their guns removed to carry more fuel and achieve greater speeds. These pilots were flying unarmed into enemy territory. Over 3,200 missions were flown in direct support of Operation Overlord. The French resistance played a crucial role too, highlighting targets for future flights and monitoring German troop movements. Perhaps even more dangerous were the specialized boat crews who had previously assisted in commando raids. Their job? Sneak up on the French coastline at night, locate fixed German defenses designed to tear apart landing craft, and take depth measurements approaching the beaches. One less obvious, but ultimately vital part of the intelligence effort involved a BBC call for photographs. Anyone in Britain who had photos taken while on holiday in France before the war was asked to hand them over. A staggering 10 million images and descriptions of the French coastline were turned over to the War Office. But gathering intelligence was only half the battle. Just as important was feeding Germany's intelligence network false information. Operation Bodyguard was probably the most successful counterintelligence program in history. Allied intelligence officers concocted elaborate plans to mislead their German counterparts about almost every aspect of the D-Day landings. This would prevent the Germans from maximizing their defensive posture around Normandy and delay the arrival of reinforcements that could bog down or even destroy the invasion. One of the Allies' biggest assets? The Germans themselves. While Germany had militarily dominated Europe since 1940, their intelligence agencies were surprisingly lacking compared to British and American efforts. Coding devices like the famous Enigma machine initially allowed Germany to communicate without fear of interception. But German overconfidence led them to underestimate the Allies' ability to crack their communications, which of course the Allies did, even using primitive computers to do so. Breaking German codes gave the Allies insight into German force dispositions along the Atlantic Wall. More importantly, it let them peek into the minds of the German High Command, and it allowed them to gauge how effective their misinformation efforts were, so they could tailor future deceptions. It all worked in the Allies' favor that Hitler himself was convinced any invasion would come at Calais. Under Bodyguard's umbrella, Operation Fortitude sought to fuel Hitler's belief by creating a false picture of Allied armies amassing in England and Scotland. German intelligence was made to believe the Allies intended to land at Calais and Norway. British Army Colonel Noel Wild planned the operation, which called for creating dummy trucks, tanks, aircraft, and even entire fake military units. These could be photographed by high-flying German reconnaissance aircraft. From such altitude, it would be impossible to tell the difference between real equipment destined for Normandy and fake equipment for Fortitude. Some of the equipment looked so convincing that even people on the ground mistook it for genuine. But Fortitude went beyond building replica tanks. It involved fake radio broadcasts intended for German interception, corresponding with a false picture being built. Secret agents drip-fed the Germans information. And for every 2 radar stations Allied air forces attacked around Normandy, 2 more in surrounding areas were attacked, even if they have little impact on the actual landings. By D-Day itself, German intelligence was still convinced that as many as 10 divisions were waiting to storm Calais, even when the numbers of Allies in Normandy were entering the hundreds of thousands. And Fortitude didn't stop on D-Day. It continued deceiving the Germans that Normandy was a decoy, delaying the redeployment of German forces for as long as possible. The eventual success of D-Day can be attributed in no small part to this elaborate, highly effective deception operation. Planning never stopped as the intelligence picture constantly changed, but overall objectives remained clear. An airborne element would go in first to capture strategic locations like bridges and destroy artillery positions threatening the beaches. Then the main force would storm 5 beaches, each with its own code name. American beaches, Omaha in Utah. British beaches, Sword and Gold. Canadian beach, Juno. But this doesn't mean these beaches were assaulted exclusively by their designated nations. Far from it. Specialized personnel stood ready to transfer from one nation's beach to another if needed. On the ground, in the air, and at sea were men who had escaped their own countries before they fell to the Nazi onslaught. They were eager to start taking their land back, and likely get some revenge too. As June arrived, Eisenhower set the historic date, June 5, 1944. At 20 harbors across the UK, men and equipment were crammed aboard troop ships, ready to head to their rendezvous point, designated Piccadilly Circus, southeast of the Isle of Wight. Special attention was given to their protection following the disaster of Operation Tiger. The seaborne element was dubbed Operation Neptune. Yet despite all the secrecy, it was impossible to conceal the vast movement of ships from British ports. German gun and torpedo boats conducted attacks, though they were repelled by overwhelming Allied warship power. The Allies now had extensive experience in amphibious assaults, and much of their equipment seemed tailor-made for Normandy. The American DUKW, for example, essentially an amphibious truck that could bring supplies to the beach and drive them straight where they were needed. The British Churchill Aviary, armored vehicle Royal Engineer, was a Churchill tank with its main gun replaced by a petard spigot mortar firing a devastating 40-pound bomb known as a flying dustbin, perfect for destroying tough fortifications. Then there were the funnies, tanks modified for specific purposes. The Swimming Sherman, also known as the DD or Donald Duck tank, had a canvas flotation screen and propellers. Unlike purpose-built amphibious tanks that sacrificed armor or firepower for buoyancy, the Swimming Sherman could ditch its flotation screen on the beach and become just another M4 Sherman. Mine-clearing variants like the Crab, a Sherman fitted with a roller that spun heavy chains into the ground, detonating mines safely away from the tank. The Carpet Layer, a Churchill variant fitted with rollers to lay reinforced matting, creating a surface on which vehicles could drive up on a harder ground. And the Mulberry Harbors, prefabricated port systems designed specifically for D-Day, to be towed to Normandy and assembled like vast jigsaw puzzles at Omaha and Gold Beach. As more men embarked, nerves began to fray, and there was a growing concern about something neither the Allies nor Germans could control: the weather. Clear skies were needed for the full moon to help with navigation during airborne operations. Calm water was essential for the seaborne phase. With so much resting on perfect conditions, Eisenhower called a meeting at Southwick House at 4:15 a.m. on June 4th. He needed to discuss whether it might be necessary to delay the invasion. Ultimately, the decision rested solely on his shoulders. But he'd be making that decision based on predictions from a lanky RAF officer, Group Captain James Stagg, Operation Overlord's chief meteorological officer. Stagg's job was to interpret information from weather stations, observation posts, and combat aircraft flying weather patrols across the British Isles. And the news wasn't good. Stagg, a non-combat officer holding rank equivalent to an Army colonel, had the unenviable task of telling a room full of some of the war's most important leaders that, in his opinion, the invasion should be delayed 24 hours to allow the weather to improve. Many in attendance, including Field Marshal Montgomery, scoffed at the suggestion. They knew they only had a 3-day window for the moon phase. Delays could mean postponing the operation for weeks. Worse for Stagg, American meteorologists using a different prediction system believed a high-pressure front would push the bad weather away, leaving clear skies on June 5th. But Stagg remained adamant. Hold off for 24 hours. After listening to Stagg's case, Eisenhower reluctantly agreed. The invasion was postponed until June 6th. Stagg was proven correct when, on the night of June 4th and morning of June 5th, landing zones were lashed with terrible weather. Finally, as conditions improved on June 5th, the original D-Day date, the preparation phase began. Minesweepers snuck to the Normandy coast to clear paths for troop ships. A massive force of over 1,200 combat aircraft began softening defenses. Through the night and into D-Day itself, the weakened Luftwaffe would be outnumbered almost 10-1. Rocket-firing aircraft like the British Typhoon became heavily engaged in clearing fortifications and destroying tanks. As Allied troops realized this was it, they reminded themselves of Eisenhower's words. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. Meanwhile, far from the commotion at countless airfields in the UK and aboard the vast fleet in the English Channel, at his residence high in the Bavarian Alps, Adolf Hitler settled in for a relatively peaceful evening at the Wolf's Lair. He and his entourage watched newsreels in his private cinema before retreating to the lounge, where Hitler lectured them on his thoughts, war, politics, his views on great men of history. Looking back on that evening, Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels said it was like the good old times when the regime was on the rise to ultimate power. Goebbels retired to bed earlier than Hitler, who'd been having trouble sleeping. It wasn't until 3 a.m. that the Führer finally went to bed, sleep coming courtesy of medication. German intelligence was already picking up indications that something big was getting underway across the channel. But fearful of Hitler's temper, his aides decided not to inform him until they had more information. And so, as Hitler drifted into a medically aided sleep, he was unaware that a vast armada of aircraft carrying paratroopers was already cruising toward Normandy. Unaware that his dreams of a 1,000-year Reich were about to be shattered. Unaware that history was tying a noose around his neck. As the final minutes of June 5th ticked away, an air armada, unlike anything history had ever witnessed, began to mobilize across England. The workhorse of this operation was the Douglas C-47 Skytran, or as the British called it, the Dakota, one of history's truly great aircraft, a military variant of the DC-3 airliner, the plane that made air travel practical for the masses. American and British C-47s would eventually drop some 50,000 paratroopers into Normandy. They provide a vital logistical lifeline, dropping supplies until airfields could be captured and secured. Their rugged design made them ideal for getting in and out of captured ex-Luftwaffe bases. But it was a dangerous task. Even with defenses softened, the aircraft were relatively slow. And when deploying paratroopers, they had to descend to around 600 feet, where they were exposed to every type of anti-aircraft fire the Germans could throw at them. Upon leaping from the aircraft, a static line automatically deployed each trooper's parachute. But if the chute failed or tangled, the paratrooper had just seconds to release his emergency parachute. And even then, with less time to slow his descent, he'd almost certainly hit the ground hard, broken legs, shattered ankles. If all went well, the descent took 35 seconds. 35 seconds of feeling extraordinarily exposed to keen-eyed German snipers, their silhouettes stark against the night sky. To help draw enemy fire away from real soldiers, hundreds of par dummies, Ruperts to the British, Oscars to the Americans, were dropped. In the darkness, they couldn't be distinguished from actual paratroopers. Parachuting into Normandy that night were elements of the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, assigned various objectives on the Cotentin Peninsula west of Utah Beach. But nothing went according to plan. The aircraft took heavy fire during their approach. Many were lost before their troops could even jump. First Lieutenant Robert P. Matthias of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne, earned the tragic distinction of being the first American killed on D-Day. The C-47 he was aboard was hit by anti-aircraft fire, mortally wounding him before he had a chance to jump with his men. In the chaos, many paratroopers missed their drop zones, often by miles. Units were scattered, disorganized, separated from their commanders. Despite these setbacks, the paratroopers fought fiercely. They destroyed artillery guns, disrupted supply routes, and diverted German attention away from the beaches. Small groups of men, often from different units thrown together by chance, accomplished their missions through sheer determination and improvisation. Not all airborne forces arrived by parachute. Many came via gliders, towed to release points near their targets, then piloted down in what was essentially a controlled crash. Gliders had the advantage of carrying larger equipment, light vehicles, field guns, but they came with their own deadly risks. Just as vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire as powered aircraft, with the added danger that landing them safely was a tricky undertaking. Get it wrong, and men could be killed or injured before they even had a chance to fight. The British airspeed Horsa could transport up to 30 fully equipped troops or various light vehicles and field guns. Despite its size and lack of engines, it was surprisingly agile in flight. Given that few would survive their first flight into battle, the Horsa was manufactured using wood, which helped conserve strategic metals. The Hamilcar was another large glider, designed primarily to carry light tanks or 17-pound field guns. An American design, fielded solely by the British, built around specifications outlined by Winston Churchill himself in 1941. The most numerous glider was the American Waco CG-4, known as the Hadrian in British service. Smaller than the Horsa, carrying only 13 combat-ready troops with equipment, a single jeep, or a single 75mm howitzer. But its smaller size gave it the advantage of landing in tighter areas, greatly expanding potential landing sites. The CG-4 featured a welded tubular fuselage with canvas covering, wings skinned in thin plywood. The nose and cockpit were mounted on a hinge, allowing them to swing upward and expose the entire cargo area. And because glider landings were often violent, a safety cable was fitted to attach to any vehicle being carried inside. Should the vehicle break free and slide forward when the glider hit the ground, the cable would lift the hinged cockpit upward, saving the pilots from being run over by their own cargo. The British 6th Airborne Division made extensive use of gliders in capturing bridges over the River Orne and King Canal. Taking the bridges relatively quickly, they then had to dig in and fight tooth and nail to keep them until reinforcements arrived. Of all 5 beaches on D-Day, the 10-mile stretch designated Omaha was by far the most heavily defended. Heavy bombers hit the beach prior to landing, but the crews had to contend with thick clouds blanketing the area. They had a bomb blind. Concerned their weapons might stray and hit the Allied armada, the crews proved too cautious. Many bombs missed their targets, falling inland on the French countryside instead. A particularly concerning obstacle for both American beaches was a gun battery at Point du Hoc, a 100-foot cliff providing a wide arc of fire over the surrounding areas, including the beaches where thousands of Americans would be landing. Before the main force arrived, 225 men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Rutter, were given an unenviable task: scale the cliffs with ropes and ladders to destroy the gun battery. The Rangers approached in 12 landing craft and 2 DUKW amphibious trucks. They took heavy fire as they neared the beach. One landing craft was lost with all but one of its occupants. They began placing 100-foot ladders, borrowed from the London Fire Brigade, against the cliffs and started climbing, all while taking heavy machine gun and mortar fire. With Allied warships providing fire support, the Rangers reached the top where they discovered their targets. The field guns had been moved. The Rangers eventually located the weapons, left unguarded in an orchard over half a kilometer south, and destroyed them. Mission accomplished, but now they had to hold their position. Over the next 24 hours, they fought desperate battles with German forces until reinforcements arrived. By then, they'd suffered 77 men killed and 152 wounded. At 6:30 a.m., the first wave, men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, made their landings into what seemed like an impenetrable wall of bullets. In the space between landing craft and cover in front of German positions, bodies of fallen U.S. troops soon littered the sand. Barbed wire and fixed obstacles slowed the American advance, allowing German machine guns to methodically cut them down. There was so much death on Omaha in those opening hours that when landing craft were seen leaving the beach, the Germans mistakenly believed the American troops had been driven off. General Dietrich Kreis ordered many troops guarding Omaha to relocate and fight British forces at Gold Beach. It was a major error. The landing craft were simply returning to ships to pick up more U.S. troops to throw at the defenses. Yet even with combat engineers blasting away fixed defenses, warships providing fire support, and tanks being landed to support assaults, U.S. troops failed to secure their beachhead and link up with British forces from Gold Beach on D-Day itself. Instead, they managed to secure 2 strongpoints on the beach. Over the following days, they offloaded men and supplies, finally cleared out the German defenders, secured the beach, and linked up with Allied units from other beaches. A number of journalists accompanied troops ashore to report on what they saw. Among them was a driven, determined young woman named Martha Gellhorn, wife of author Ernest Hemingway. Gellhorn wasn't actually authorized to report on the landings. So in a daring move, she stowed away aboard a hospital ship, then impersonated a stretcher-bearer to join medical teams going ashore to retrieve the wounded. Given the chaos unfolding around her, she pulled off the deception and became the only woman to land at Normandy on D-Day. Her article, published in Collier's magazine, captured the scene. Everyone was violently busy on that crowded, dangerous shore. The pebbles were the size of apples and feet deep, and we stumbled up a road that a huge road shovel was scooping out. We walked with the utmost care between the narrowly placed white tape lines that marked the mine-cleared path, and headed for a tent marked with a red cross. Everyone agreed that the beach was a stinker and that it would be a great pleasure to get the hell out of here sometime. Utah Beach was the last to be selected in D-Day planning. It extended over 11 miles of shore and was added to provide a launching point for capturing the vital port of Cherbourg. The 4th Infantry Division led the assault here. Due to strong currents, the landing craft drifted about 2,000 yards south of their intended target. This accident turned out to be fortunate. The troops landed at a less heavily defended sector. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of President Theodore Roosevelt, famously declared, "We'll start the war from right here," when he realized they were in the wrong place. Utah saw the lightest casualties of all the beaches, with about 200 killed and wounded out of 23,000 troops landed. The success here allowed rapid movement inland to link up with paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions who had dropped behind enemy lines during the night. By the end of June 6, 1944, approximately 156,000 Allied troops had successfully landed in Normandy. While none of the assault forces achieved all their D-Day objectives, they had secured a crucial foothold in Nazi-occupied Europe. The casualties were significant but less than feared, about 10,000 Allied casualties, with 4,414 confirmed dead, compared to worst-case scenarios predicting up to 75% losses on some beaches. The success of D-Day marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. Within 11 months, Nazi Germany would surrender unconditionally, ending World War II in Europe.